Hey, happy June 1st, 2023 at 11 a.m. my time. My name is Patrick Lovell, and I'm truth bombing and riffing to try and create the largest populist movement in the history of the world to purge the largest conspiracy of corruption in the history of the world. And the only reason why what's happening now is bigger than what's happened before throughout history is technology, first and foremost. There's the coordination and the continuity and the complicity of those that are in control and those that are hiding what's happening is monumental. But so too is a whole lot of other surprising factors that continue to frustrate me to no end. And I'm just going to riff and I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth, to be honest with you, but I just have to go for it. So I think first and foremost, for us to be on the same page, we have to understand what's afoot in the United States that is incredibly um, troubling, potentially terrifying, depending on who you are, and from where I'm sitting, completely unacceptable. I'll start first with fascism, coordinated fascism, incredibly organized fascism. And that's exactly what this is. And if you haven't been able to notice this and see it by now, you're completely eyes wide shut. But I'll start with what appears to be um, a really insidious and effective level of um, execution of hatred and fascism in the state of Florida, led by Ron DeSantis, and a lot that comes with it. I got a call last night from somebody I admire greatly, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Jacobs, a defense attorney, a foreclosure defense attorney out of Miami. And this guy is about as courageous as anybody I've ever met. Probably one of the few that I've met who've gone to the lengths that I have in sacrificing everything to try to overcome this insanity that is creating the hole that we're all in the midst of, which leads to fascism. And so he calls me and he says, "Look, in addition to everything we know in the state of Florida, there's this full-on capture, if you will, of what was previously a liberal arts school. It's kind of a test run for this sort of ideological purge of all things, anything that resembles, I guess, any. It definitely fits within the umbrella and the scope of the progressive movement, but it filters on this sort of, which has been used throughout really the Christian right throughout my lifetime in the United States. And it's weird to me because I'm not sexually suppressed, I guess, and nor have I ever been. And so, I can't speak to what it is that people go through that are terrified of God's judgment and how they operate. But then we've known for centuries that perversion happens in churches, and it has throughout time, but it was more clear to everybody, probably over the last decade, of what's been going on in churches, particularly Catholic churches, for a very long time. I sequence this, and because there's this repression that leads to this anger, this angst, this animosity towards what appears to be the LGBTQ and transgender, world, if you will. And I don't know much about it because it's not really my thing. But at the same time, I'm all about human rights and universal rights and sexuality. You want to be gay? That's great. Go let your freak flag fly and have a lot of fun, and good for you, right? I mean, I'm not gay, but I certainly don't pass judgment on anybody's sexuality. There's so much involved and whatever. But the bottom line is I have the same sort of attitude towards people that are repressed. I've got a bit of a libertarian bent where it's like, look, man, you want to go to your Baptist church on Sundays and be a holy roller and, believe that everybody's going to go to hell because, they do something in their lives that you disapprove of. Okay, fine. Go ahead and be that way. The only problem I have is when you reach out of that sort of cocoon of your place of worship and you get an AR-15 and you walk into a gay club and start murdering people. That's when it becomes unacceptable. And unfortunately, that happens a lot, and it continues to look like it's on the rise. You put all of these things together, you can see that deregulation of any sort of common sense gun regulation to do background checks on people that might be depraved to get weapons of mass destruction. I mean, given just the sort of basics of what you have to go through to get a driver's license, and my son just went through this, which is extraordinary compared to when I was 16 years old and I got a driver's license. It's absurd to think that we can, on the one hand, expect certain regulation and safety code and common sense regulation as it relates to driving, but not firearms, particularly those that are high grade, high octane military assault weapons. I mean, it's just absurd. And anybody who has a half a brain could never, ever not be able to see exactly how this whole thing manifests to what end. It uses it to basically marginalize people, create sort of a cohesion in people that are more in tune with this sort of hate rhetoric, and then it galvanizes them. They become a voting bloc and potentially more. And we've seen just never ending representations of this for years. Particularly going back to the Trump administration and all things Charlottesville and the neo-Nazis and the oddity of the Costco tiki torches and everything that manifested in context to Jews will not replace us. And then, of course, one of the skinheads decided to take his car and ram it into anti-fascist protesters. I mean, this is insane, and it has been going on for a long time. But now it's much more organized and a part of the structure, particularly of what's happening in the right-wing apparatus, because it's connected to big money. Now, I've mentioned on several of these truth bombs in the past, one of my biggest concerns with Donald Trump as it related to the January 6th insurrection was I've never in a million years bought the fact that Donald Trump was the mastermind behind the insurrection. I think he was, like he always is, just kind of a dumbfounding, bloviating cartoon joker fool that was the face of everybody else's, top level coordination. And I'm imagining that came from Steve Bannon and all of his relationships with the likes of the Mercers and probably the Koch brothers and other billionaire foundations that were probably the same guy whose name eludes me at the moment that was responsible for, Clarence Thomas, the billionaire out of Dallas. And, these guys on the right have been for decades incredibly skilled at organizing. So whether it's a hostile takeover of the Supreme Court, vis-a-vis what I'm referring to by way of Clarence Thomas, and we know that it doesn't end there, although he's obviously the most, I'd say, transparent at the moment in terms of what we know. But these guys, with the insurrection, in context to, there were 10,000 MAGA demonstrators that showed up from all over the country, many of whom were police officers, and many of whom were part of the military, and maybe even many were most likely special ops forces that we saw, and I believe, personally, it's just an instinct, I don't have evidence of this, but that came out of Blackwater and Eric Prince. Because if you know anything about Blackwater, these guys were guns for hires, mercenaries, all over the Middle East throughout all of the wars from Iraq forward. And they saw some heavy-duty fighting, especially in Fallujah when I believe it first started. But these guys were basically private contractors. And since they went out and they got hired by, Saudis and royals and, whatever oil-rich state and protect those guys. If you think about it in terms of a pop culture reference, it reminds me of with the Golden Compass. I guess that was the mercenaries that Cersei hired in Game of Thrones, that got torched eventually by Daenerys Targaryen. But that's how these guys operate. And Eric Prince is a billionaire, and he networks with other billionaires, and they're involved with financiers and all sorts of crazy stuff on a global scenario. And I'm pretty convinced that during the Black Lives Matter riots and also Antifa riots in Portland, for example, do you remember when unmarked vehicles and all of a sudden all of these unmarked, look like special ops types guys were jumping out of vans and then getting protesters and taking them away, and they weren't identified? And then former Attorney General of the United States under the Trump administration, William Barr, was saying, yeah, they don't have to identify themselves. At that time, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This thing has gone next level. And that was obviously before the January 6th insurrection. So then the insurrection happens and everything that happens. And, obviously we've seen, the Oath Keeper guy, can't think of his name. He just went down for 17 years. And of course, Ron DeSantis and company are promising to pardon him and everybody else that got arrested. And same with Donald Trump if he gets, into the White House. Which is insane. But, based on this conversation I was having with, my friend, my colleague, a guy who I love and appreciate dearly, Bruce Jacobs, is like, look, man, these fascists are overrunning education. And lo and behold, the point guy on this, and it all translates to all of this other manifestation of this stuff vis-a-vis transgender hatred and everything that's happening at that level. It's the point guy is a guy by the name of Joe Jaquat. Now, why is that important? Well, because Bruce Jacobs has revealed to me that Joe Jaquat was the general counsel of then Governor Rick Scott and whoever his attorney general was, but he was general counsel in the attorney general's office, which I'm not sure how that works because you would think that attorney general is the general counsel, typically the top attorney at a private law firm or a corporate law firm, I should say. And but anyway, so he works there, and apparently he was on the right side of everything that took place before the national mortgage settlement, because he was investigating all of the fraud that was taking place post collapse of the 2008 great financial crisis, where all of the elements of the vectors within the foreclosure mill, if you will, what we call servicers and the foreclosure mills, were doctoring up documentation fraud to steal houses, because the way standing works is that the housing securitization model and trust and everything else became such a debacle because of the volume of what these guys were doing and many other tricks that we revealed to you in our work, The Con, at www.thecon.tv. Basically, it was a crime racket operating within the courts that was, as it turns out, getting its funding from the too big to fail banks, which got its funding illegally from the Federal Reserve, which I'll circle back to momentarily. But as a result of that happening for many years, this guy, Joe Jaquat, was initially at Rick Scott's office of the Attorney General, but then he gets hired to become the general counsel for a company and an outfit by the name of Black Knight. Black Knight was doing all of the robo-signing scenarios and one of the biggest vectors in the United States because of its software that ultimately foreclosed on millions of people illegally. So this guy flips sides, goes to work as the top attorney for this company that's illegally foreclosing on everybody, and he knows all the tricks because he learned it working in the Attorney General's office. And he goes there for a number of years, and then he circles back into Ron DeSantis' Attorney General's office. And now, well, this is the most important part of that sequence. He, and it says on his website with his law firm, that he was responsible for appointing 5 Supreme Court justices in Florida during his tenure, and I believe hundreds of other justices in the appellate courts and other courts throughout the state of Florida, which is important because they were all illegally foreclosing on millions of people. Okay, I mean, this happened nationwide, and the amount of foreclosures in the state of Florida were humongous. I don't know what the specific numbers were, but ginormous. And ultimately what this means is that Bank of America held all the cards. And there's a lot to it in terms of what Bank of America was able to hide and information that Bruce Jacobs has on Bank of America in terms of subpoenas with a group that proved that 2 billion documents were destroyed by Bank of America. It's insane, the level of calamity of corruption that this all permeated, and then ultimately Ron DeSantis is in the midst of. But then how does it tie together to the fascism in schools and anti-trans movement and so forth? It's all tied to the same funding. It's all the same source. And so, like I've always told you, corruption births and fuels fascism. That's happening all over the country. In addition to that, the thing that I'm really tracking on, which has got me boondoggled, is this group that I've used to follow religiously, especially during the Occupy Wall Street movement, a online group that were, basically in the shadows, but they had a really interesting way of approaching the information that they put out there. The group was called Anonymous. And typically they were the anti-machine. They were the guys that were, these tech, you know, junkie slash experts that knew all the tricks of how information was disseminated and covered up and purged and everything else, because these guys are the guys who program and they could hack anything. And they were what they'd say, we are legion, we are anonymous, and they'd provide real information, not too dissimilar to all of the type of revelations that we saw from WikiLeaks and everything associated with that, but more so. But now they have completely switched teams. They've got a completely different execution, different people involved. But when you watch all of their latest revelations, it's all this sort of monkey business, science fiction like Orwellian execution that's Q like, that basically says, look, the power's got complete control. They're screwing everybody over. They're corrupt to their eyeballs, and everything that you hear from me. But then they twist it to basically be like, oh yeah, and it's all because they want to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't become your next president, and so much more. It's just a flip of the script. It's just, the psychological, profiling and executions of the things that I've been aware of for decades that the CIA has been involved with, and other forms of intelligence warfare, and it's playing out here. And that's one piece of it. So you put those two things together, in addition to two political candidates that are serving this MAGA audience that's getting more and more right wing by the day, and you foster in the hatred of LGBTQ and trans and everything else, and then no regulation on AR-15s. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand what this is all about. And then you see it manifest in Congress through the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and, of all people, I hate to even bring his name up, but George Santos. But then, of course, everybody, from Ted Cruz all the way to McCarthy. And one of my theories is, like, during the great financial crisis, what we learned was, in the hierarchy of how loans got processed, the industries would hire the least the least experienced people they could find, and they put them in the positions of power and told them what to do with a script so that they wouldn't know what they were doing. And they made more money off a deal than they did working in fast food, the previous years. So they were very willing to be complicit in this mammoth fraud that we show you in the con. Again, www.thecon.tv. I think the equivalent of that are these types of people in Congress who literally have no idea how things work, but that just kind of fit a certain metric to be able to speak to the people that, the puppet masters want to control on the right side, and they do it extremely effectively. So it's the blind leading the blind, and it always punches sideways or down to the most vulnerable. And so, per everything I've already said in here, that's what they're doing. But it's all to mask the massive corruption by the system that has control of everything. Now, where do I come in? Well, I come in because I did the deep dive on all things 2008 Great Financial Crisis, which is the largest cover-up of the largest criminal conspiracy in history that never ended. And I find myself today having to battle people that you would think, and have been for the most part, on our side, minus this caveat. In my exploration, putting the con together, I had to do a number of things to check off the boxes to put the investigation together in a way that was bulletproof. And the first thing that I did, because I got lucky, was I ran into a gentleman vis-a-vis me seeing him on a Sunday morning talk show where I realized he was the guy who had all the answers. And then it took me years and years to find out how he got all the answers and then what they all meant. His name is William K. Black. And William K. Black taught me and my colleagues how the whole system works. And so then we had to go out and find out how to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to basically show the American people in a way that would keep their attention what happened, because this was the role of the government should have done this. But the government didn't do this. The government obfuscated what exactly happened, talked out of both sides of their mouth, told you everything that I ended up telling you, but at the same time hiding it, and then ultimately media buried it because media is so confused and played to the lowest common denominator, which winds up in this whole, upside down, inside out, perverted scenario from Trump forward. And I know many of you out there would agree with me that if you know anything about Donald Trump and what he's being investigated for and what evidence we already have on this guy, given everything that's happened really decades in advance of him winning the presidency, but during the presidency and everything that happened, there is no way in hell this guy is walking around breathing free air unless A, he has something huge on the system that could take him down that they don't want to jeopardize themselves because maybe he'll go public with something that he knows, or they just don't want to take him down because A, they have to reveal the whole system of which he's a mirror of, and then B, maybe they find him to be a useful idiot to control everybody so that the machinations and the mechanics of what I'm revealing to you is never known. Which brings me full circle to why I'm incredibly frustrated. And I'll finish with this. Look, man, I've been on a serious grind. I call it the righteous grind. This was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. And in the process, I lost everything that mattered to me, but finding everything that mattered. Incredible irony, incredibly difficult to live with. But over the course of the last several days, I've dealt with two giant exclamation points in my personal life that really bring this whole thing home. The first is my son graduated from high school, which is fabulous. It's kind of a miracle and under the circumstances, considering what he had to go through and a lot of the things that we had to go through. But he turned things around and he got through it. And but I cried a lot when it happened because I was thinking about all of the devastating things that happened to me in my domestic life as a result of me bringing all of this information to the public and it basically being suppressed and ignored. And it never really went anywhere after years and years of effort and me promising my family that there was a rainbow at the end of the tunnel. And there never was. And ultimately, my life fell apart. I couldn't provide for my family. And my wife and I went through a horrific, self destruction. And we got separated. And this during my son's high school years. And, I had had dreams my whole life of my son being Mr. All America and a super football star and being a winner at every stage. And he was all that and is all of that to a degree, but he fell apart because of everything that broke up our family. And he made some bad choices that led to more bad choices. And that happens. And it happens to millions of people. And it all happened to us because I found the truth, the $29 trillion truth. That is the biggest revelation of the last 70 years, maybe in history, all things considered, and it has no value, and it's fallen on deaf ears, even though there are literally over 100 million victims of this directly, 50 million people in the United States, and you would think that if I got to 1% of those, we would have been wildly successful. But we didn't. We didn't for a number of reasons. I don't have all of the evidence of what actually took place to prevent the con from reaching the audience that it needs to see, but we all know how much noise there is. If there's not a lot of people talking about something, A, you're not going to register with the algorithms. B, if it's too complex, which many people who have watched the con have said it's thick with information, it's hard for them to track. That's another side of it. I read something a couple of days ago that in 2011, I believe, that a study was done about what our attention spans are online, and it was something like 4 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes, and now it's 47 seconds. We're so inundated with information and mostly misinformation that nobody can see the forest for the trees. And so when I say things like, this is the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that set up tens of millions of people that had their lives absolutely devastated, from everybody that was in home ownership that fell through the cracks because of all sorts of different scenarios of refinancing and all manner, shape, or form of incredible criminality and fraudulent activity that took place, particularly in the poorer communities of America. And then ultimately, it devastated working class people. It destroyed the United States. It destroyed the middle class. It destroyed the American dream. And it also destroyed the integrity of the law. It destroyed the integrity of our systems. There's a way things are written appropriately to work. But what's happened in the process of the last 20 years has been an insane race to the bottom because of corruption. I mean, it really starts in the Reagan administration, but during the Clinton administration, we created insane deregulation that opened up the opportunity for all of this stuff to happen. And then when it all blew up based on a massive criminal racketeering enterprise that we proved to you in the con, it led to an illegal guaranteed backstop of lender of last resort by the Federal Reserve, vis-a-vis Federal Reserve Act 13.3, that through the statutes you see that you have to lend, there's certain criteria of being able to provide emergency loans to financial uh, you know financial structures that need it, i.e., the investment banks and all of the too big to fail banks and that sort of thing, but based on the value of collateral. And also, nowhere does it say in the statutes that if that collateral that they have is worth nothing, which is insolvency, which then you can't provide LOR, LOLR activity unless you just backdoor it and nobody knows it. And that's exactly what they did because they thought there is no alternative. There, of course, was many alternatives, but what I'm telling you is that it was easier to lie, steal, and cheat than actually allow the truth to prevail, and that we prove that we're a nation of laws where everybody is accountable, which, of course, is not the case. The entire financial system was in on this. This was the largest racketeering scheme in history in which there was literally tens of millions of felonies. I don't need to lay it all out for you now. I've got it in the con. And the con's going to disappear. It's crazy. Like everything else that I've worked so valiantly for all the right reasons, because I believe in liberty and justice above all, and I believe in the integrity of the law. What's so hard for people above the line, which I call maybe anybody 10% or above, is that they can't understand the level of criminality that took place, because in the end, these people never got out of their capacity to function. They manage their lives. Most likely they're professionals, doctors, accountants, people that have jobs that are in careers, tech people, you name it, where they purchase a house, they did things correctly, they manage their money correctly, they use debt when they need to, they use leverage when they need to, that sort of thing, which is what you're supposed to do in America to build wealth. So they can't comprehend what happened to so many other people that couldn't survive what took place in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis. Because we spent trillions of dollars into the financial system that artificially increased the value of assets of the top 10%. And then, of course, astronomically for the top 0.1%. As I've continued to lay out to you, trillions of dollars were looted from the Federal Reserve to massively increase the power and control and entrenched interest of the system that blew up the world. That's what we're talking about. And the way it manifests ultimately, and this is how corruption births fascism. Now they've got everybody going in circles and crazy based on all of the things I mentioned in terms of MAGA. But the way it happens on the left is everybody's in silos and nobody can see the forest for the trees. And nobody realizes that we've got to come together, and drop, what's specifically important to us as individuals and come together as legion to be able to overcome the corruption with the truth and the evidence that all buried. And I'll give you one last antidote. So I did an incredible podcast that revealed a lot of what I have on the shelf for season 2. When I did it with my friends from the New Progressives. It's called the Real Progressives, I'm sorry. It's called the New Untouchables. And we lay out incredibly important information. A lot of this is what I had on the shelf for season 2 of the con that I could never put together because we got destroyed by the market and we got destroyed by the system. And hopefully one day I'll find out exactly how that worked out. But as of yet, I can only speculate in every direction. But, what I found on my pathway was I had to understand the Federal Reserve. And I got there through modern monetary theory. MMT taught me about the functions and the pragmatics of the differences between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I became quite astute at that, as well as understanding, because my path led me to what was known as the Levy study, done by a phenomenal economist who is part of the MMT sort of thought leadership, if you will. And he revealed in the Levy study with his team how the $29 trillion was used specifically. And he was the one who first let me understand that, to his sort of theorizing, was that 50% of all of the capacity that was loaned into existence was done so illegally. That's when I first started getting the understanding of, wait a second. So what are the methodologies and the precision of what you're supposed to loan to and how, and what are the statutes and that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I came across this interview with the senior principal partner of Roger and Cohen, or sorry, Sullivan and Cromwell. His name was Roger Cohen, where he revealed to the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission exactly what happened, which is exactly what I'm telling you. In addition to that, so if you've made it to this far of this truth bomb, today there's been a revelation that Jamie Dimon took the stand in the case of Epstein, where the general counsel of Chase, who came out of the Securities and Exchange Commission, was notifying Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Chase, that this guy Epstein was up to no good, and they had to basically distance themselves. Jamie Dimon had none of it. He ignored it. He ignored the warnings. And as it turns out, there was some emails that just got recently revealed that he said something along the lines of, "Yeah, I'll take my snacks," or something like that. It was like this sort of what's it called? Like when you intuit something, read between the lines. It appears that Jamie Dimon may very well have been involved with Epstein's everything. Okay, and we already know Chase was involved with Madoff, and we already know that there were 5, massive convictions of Chase over the course of the last 7 years, including a RICO conviction for insider trading in the metals markets. So power can deceive. Power can lie. Sullivan and Cromwell was what gave birth to the CIA, among other things. And now you have this incredibly confused public because, as we've seen, mainstream media couldn't even get on first base with what I'm telling you. And they continue to be just platforms of lies. Of course, Fox agreed to a $787 million settlement in terms of, all things regarding the 2020 election, and of course what led to the insurrection. And now that's kind of like what yesterday's news is. It happened like what, 3 weeks ago? The system is insanely corrupt. It's a sinking ship. The billionaires have been able to spend billions to corrupt the system, to loot trillions. And all of you are fighting each other or running around in confused, like, insanity, where all of these culture wars are leading to the types of things that have happened throughout our history and throughout history writ large. Corruption births fascism. I paid a heavy price to understand how all of this works. I've sacrificed everything to get to this point. And the only way forward is to elevate this truth above the noise and sea of confusion and lies with an informed populace that becomes super motivated to join me on a populist tidal wave to crusade to purge corruption. And because billionaires spend billions to loot trillions, they've got the system locked up. They own the media, like George Carlin said. They own the courts. They own all the businesses that matter. And they're fucking you. And that's the whole point. This is not what we can sit on the sidelines and watch. I got into a little bit of a debate with somebody on Twitter last night when I said, would you have sat on the sidelines watching a lynching? Would you have sat on the sidelines during everything that led to the Holocaust? A lot of people do. And that's how craziness happens. That's how massive tragedy happens. We should know better from history. And I'm here to remind you that you cannot sit on your hands. You cannot wait for somebody else to save you. We together have to save ourselves. You plus me equals we the people. And ultimately, I'm asking you to invest $13 so that I can get this elevated and bring in 13 people so I can get this podcast off the ground. And so I can get, this next phase tour where I have this vision of a kind of a revival tour where we take this to the people in cities across America, where I display everything that I have and then some to put it all together and eventually wind up in Washington, D.C. before the presidential election and a modern civil rights-like movement to purge corruption. Because there is no choice. Everything is on the line. Everything. Climate change isn't going to get fixed until we get a clean new deal. Systemic predation in prisons is not going to be fixed until we get a clean new deal. The underlying tumor of corruption is not going to be fixed until we get a clean new deal. So if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in decency, dignity, integrity, liberty, and sustainability merge in unity, we will defeat the misery of tyranny, and that will be our destiny. Because I am ushering in the clean New Deal, and it's got to take millions of us. Failure is not an option. Rise, war, revolt, onwards and upwards.